So if you want to film beautiful, clean, sharp video, then this video is just for you. And we'll be going through some basic video principles on how to film, and also understanding a little bit about frame rates and the exposure triangle. So let's get into it. So you may have heard of the term FPS, and FPS stands for frames per second, and frames per second means exactly what it stands for actually. It's pictures per second. So all of these pictures are combined and collated in 1 second of film. So if I move my hand like this in a second, they are actually, I'm filming with a iPhone camera, and this camera is filming at 30 frames per second. So you can say 30 pictures in this 1 second of film as I use my hand, as I wave at you. And this actually means it is 30 pictures in 1 second of film. So in American filmmaking, mostly they are using 24 frames per second, and this is because moving objects create or produce a natural motion blur, which our eyes and brain kind of perceive as movie-like, and this is why they use 24 frames per second. So higher frame rates, typically 60 to 120 frames per second, are used to create a more realistic motion or smoother motion. And you can also find this in broadcasting, where sports are broadcasted, as well as soap operas, to get a more realistic type of feel, and it gives a more immersive experience. So it's quite easy to set your frames per second, and you can go straight to the menu button, and just underneath the camera icon you'll see that the moving recording size is 25 frames per second. You can set your camera to 25 frames per second or 50, depending on what you want to film. So now that you learned a little bit about frames per second, the next step is to set your shutter speed. But your shutter speed is dependent on what is your frame rate. So we use something called the 180 degree rule in film, and that means that your shutter speed needs to be set to double your frame rate. Okay, that sounds a little bit confusing, but what it basically means that if you set your frame rate to 25 frames per second, then you need to times that by 2, and it will equal what shutter speed that you need to set. So on Canon cameras, you will normally see that it shows 25 frames per second. So if I times 25 by 2, that is equal to 50. So that should be my shutter speed, which is 50. And also if I want a bit of a higher frame rate and it's 50 frames per second, I times that by 2 to get my shutter speed, which is 100. And this is called the 180 degree shutter rule. So for natural looking motion blur, it's important to actually follow the 180 degree rule, because it makes your videos look more cinematic. So now that we set our frames per second and shutter speed, the next step is to move on to aperture, or otherwise known as f-stop. So what's important to know about f-stop or aperture is that this setting allows natural light to come into your camera, where the last setting, which I'll speak about a little bit later, called ISO, lets in artificial light. So you want to maximize your natural light inside the lens. And this is actually a diaphragm inside your camera, which expands and contracts to control the amount of light that comes into the sensor. And we can control this using the numbers called f-stop. So f-stop, the lower we go, the more the aperture expands. So it's actually letting in a lot of light. So if you are around f1 or f2, you'll see that the diaphragm, or the iris of the camera, has expanded so much to let the light in. So if you're in a dark place, like a room, or you're filming at somebody's wedding, then you may see the light is kind of dim, and you want to put the maximum amount of natural light into your camera. So you have to increase your diaphragm or your aperture to let in a lot of light, and then you've maximized your natural light inside your camera. So this is the last setting, and ISO is actually a camera setting that will brighten or darken your video image. And as you increase your ISO, your video image will grow progressively brighter, and also if you decrease it, then it will go darker. So if you have maxed out your other settings, so for example you've used your shutter speed and your aperture or f-stop to get the max amount of lighting inside your camera, then that means the last resort is your ISO. The only thing is that if you raise your ISO too high, I normally stick at 1600, and if I go higher than that, then I start getting something called grain, and grain is something that you kind of want to avoid. So if you go higher than that, then you can potentially get grain in your camera depending on what camera you have. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and learned some basic video principles. You can like and subscribe below, and I will give some more helpful video tutorials on cameras, other DSLR cameras, and other tips that I find out as I go along. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you soon.